So let's talk more about sleep and depression. It's well known that the architecture of sleep is disrupted in depression. What's the architecture of sleep? I've done entire episodes about this, but very briefly in 2 sentences, although they'll probably be run-on sentences. Early in the night, you tend to have slow wave sleep more than REM sleep or rapid eye movement sleep. As the night goes on, you tend to have more rapid eye movement sleep. That architecture of slow wave sleep preceding rapid eye movement sleep is radically disrupted in major depression. In addition, the pattern of activity in the brain during particular phases of sleep is disrupted. Now, this is during sleep, so this can't be that people are creating this situation for themselves. These are real physiological signs that something is off in this so-called autonomic or vegetative nervous system. And then there are some other things that relate to the autonomic nervous system, but that we normally think of as more voluntary in nature. And these are things like decreased appetite. So you could imagine that one could have decreased appetite because of the anhedonia, the lack of pleasure from food, right? If you don't enjoy food, then you might be less motivated to eat it. That makes sense. As well, because of these disruptions in the autonomic nervous system, these vegetative symptoms, as they're called, you can imagine that someone would have decreased appetite because some of the hormones associated with appetite, hypocretin-orexin and things of that sort, ghrelin, that those would be disrupted. And if those names of hypocretin-orexin and ghrelin don't make any sense to you, don't worry about it. What those are just hormones that impact when we eat, when we feel hungry, and when we crave food more, as well as when we feel full. We have enough so-called satiety. If you want to learn more about those, we did entire episodes on eating and metabolism. So you can see that the symptomology of major depression impacts us at multiple levels. There's the conscious level of how excited we are generally. Well, that's reduced. There's grief, there's guilt, there's crying. But then there's also these vegetative things. There's disruptions in sleep, which of course make everything more challenging when we're awake. We know that. Sleep is so vital for resetting. You're waking up early, you can't get back to sleep. That's going to adjust your affect, your emotions in negative ways. We know this. And appetite is off. And there are hormones that get disrupted. So cortisol levels are increased. In particular, there's a signature pattern of depression whereby cortisol, this stress hormone that normally is released in a healthy way only in the early part of the day, is shifted to late in the day. In fact, a 9 p.m. peak in cortisol is one of the physiological signatures of depressive-like states. It's not the only one, but it is an important one. So there are a lot of things going on in major depression. And by now you're probably thinking, oh goodness, this is dreadful. Like there's all this terrible stuff. And indeed, it is terrible. It is a terrible thing to find oneself in a mode where things feel sad, you feel guilty, you're exhausted. And oftentimes there's also an association with the anxiety system. So just because people are exhausted and lethargic and they don't enjoy things doesn't necessarily mean that there's an absence of anxiety. There can also be a lot of anxiety about what's going to happen to me. Am I going to be able to achieve my goals in life? Will I ever get out of this state? And so things really start to layer on. And if this sounds depressing to you, it is indeed depressing. This is really the place that many people find themselves, and it's a pit that they just don't know how to climb out of. So let's just take a few minutes and talk about some of the underlying biology that creates this cloud or this constellation of symptomology. I think that's really important to do because if we want to understand the various treatments, how they work and why they work and how to implement them, we have to understand some of the underlying biology. So let's spend a few minutes talking about the biology of depression. What's known, what's not known. Because in doing that, I think you'll get a much clearer picture about why certain tools work to relieve depression and why others might not. So one of the most important early findings in the search for a biological basis of depression was this finding that there are drugs that relieve some of the symptoms of depression. Those drugs generally fall into 3 major categories, but the first set of ones that were discovered were the so-called tricyclic antidepressants and the MAO inhibitors, the monoamine oxidase inhibitors. You don't need to understand that nomenclature, but I'm going to give you a little bit of detail so that if you want to understand it, you can. Most of this work took place in the late 1950s and in the 1960s and continued well until the 1980s when new classes of drugs were discovered. And these tricyclic antidepressants and the MAO inhibitors largely worked by increasing levels of norepinephrine in the brain, as well as in the body in some cases. And they were discovered through a kind of odd set of circumstances. We don't have time to go into all the history, but suffice to say that they were discovered because of the exploration for drugs that alter blood pressure. Norepinephrine impacts blood pressure, and drugs that lower blood pressure reduce levels of norepinephrine, and that in many cases was shown to lead to depression or depressive-like symptoms. And so these drugs, these tricyclic drugs and the MAO inhibitors actually increase norepinephrine, and frankly, they do quite a good job of relieving some, if not all, of the symptoms of major depression. However, they carry with them many side effects. Some of those side effects are side effects related to blood pressure itself. By increasing noradrenaline, norepinephrine as it's called, you raise blood pressure. That can be dangerous. That can be uncomfortable. But they also have a lot of other side effects. And the reason they have other side effects is because they impact systems in the brain and in the body that impact things like libido, appetite, digestion, and others. And we'll talk about each of those in sequence. Okay, so the experience that clinicians had of observing some relief for depression with the tricyclic antidepressants and with MAO inhibitors was terrific, but there were all these side effects that people really did not like. They didn't like these drugs at all. A lot of people would get dry mouth. I mentioned the low libido. They'd have sleep issues, appetite issues, weight gain. They made some people so uncomfortable that they preferred not to take them, even though when they didn't take them, they had a worsening or a maintenance of their depressive symptoms. A decade or so later, there was the discovery of the so-called pleasure pathways in the brain. These are pathways, literally groups of neurons that reside in different locations in the brain but connect to one another, so it's a circuit. And when you stimulate these neurons with certain behaviors or with electrical stimulation in an experiment, believe it or not, that's been done in both animals and humans become very, very motivated to get more stimulation of these pathways. So this pleasure pathway, or these circuits for pleasure, are very what we call reinforcing. In fact, animals and humans will work hard to get stimulation of these brain areas even more than they will work to obtain sex, drugs, or even if they are addicted to a particular drug and they are in a state of withdrawal, the ultimate state of craving. If given a choice, a person or an animal will select to have stimulation of this pleasure pathway instead of the drug itself. And that is a major and significant finding.